Hello, I am Mantastic and Fantastic, and today I'm going to be reviewing all the new evolutions plus buffs slash upgrades for the various cards that were released in the version 11.1 patch. So I did a previous video slash article on all the changes, most notably 3-player co-op beforehand, and this is because there is actually a lot of content to cover, and it's just easier to manage if they are broken up and separated, so it's easier to also find the information you are looking for. So if you do wish to read or watch that, you can feel free to click the link here. Now, in terms of new evolutions, generally speaking, most awoken or reincarnated forms tend to be direct upgrades of existing cards. However, with this batch of new evolutions, a lot of the cards are actually better off in their current form, and this is partially why this video article will be quite lengthy, because there is some decision making to be done. You actually have to contemplate and think, provided you don't have duplicates of said monster. So the first and notable cards to receive these new evolutions are the Heroes Pantheon, and the Hero Pantheon is one of the strongest ones available. This is because they are able to provide their primary color, hearts, as well as some other collateral benefit alongside of it. And this is fantastic for monocolored teams because you're able to deal damage and heal at the same time. Now, generally speaking, these cards have been very row oriented, and that's where they generally were used as subs. As inherits, it doesn't really matter. But right now, with these new awoken forms, they are actually gaining, for the most part, 7 combo awakening and TPAs. So this does definitely raise their offensive capabilities on those combo slash TPA teams. However, they tend to lose their signature or defining aspect, and that's where a lot of the caution comes into whether or not you should awaken or keep them in their current form. So, Yamato is the first one to receive a new evolution, and in his current form right now, at least before Awoken, his signature aspect was 3 skill boosts, along with obviously having row prowess. Now, obviously row teams want to use him, but from a farming point of view, especially if you have Yamamoto, you want to have those 3 skill boosts, because 3 skill boosts in fire is actually quite a rare commodity to this day. And if you do pursue the awoken form, you do obviously lose out on those skill boosts. You do retain the recover bind awakening, so you do have the utility, but you're losing that kind of signature aspect. So unless you have a combo oriented team where you would love to have a stronger sub, I would caution against actually changing your Yamato, because you are again losing those 3 skill boosts, which is hard to really make up for if you play co-op or enjoy certain farming builds, or even if you play solo mode and need to have skills ready by a certain time. Next is Andromeda, and Andromeda is probably the MVP water sub out there in the game right now. I believe essentially every single viable or high-end team uses at least one of her as a sub, and this is because she actually had double SBR coverage, so which is very important for Mary teams. But in addition to that, she also had obviously very powerful active skill. You could kill floors as well as heal at the same time, so she was somewhat irreplaceable, and she's just generally a big step up from Gabriel in pretty much every single aspect. Now, again, this new evolution is going to lose that signature aspect of double skill bind resist, so you want to think very carefully before pulling the trigger, especially if you're using it on a Mary team, which wants rows and doesn't care for the TPAs anyways. So Andromeda does obviously have lots of potential with this new form, because with the dual TPA and 7 combo awakening, we do actually have the potential to use her on Julie teams. And Julie teams, for the most part, like to have water TPA cards outside of the very luxurious triple Ragnarok build. So for the most part, the double TPA, water TPA tends to be the safest avenue, and Andromeda does not take away her required orbs, so she becomes a stellar Julie sub to use on these TPA combo style teams. Next is Perseus, and again, Perseus was also famous for his double skill bind resist. And this new evolution basically follows suit like Andromeda. He loses the double skill bind resist as well as an additional skill boost. So this is problematic because you are going to have a less ideal team for Awoken Liu Bei farming, as well as just having less skill bind resist coverage overall. Now, this new form is obviously ideal for the very happy and friendly wood attribute that likes to have TPAs and 7 combo awakenings, most notably the new real does love to use Perseus as a sub. Obviously, losing that double skill bind resist is problematic, so you're going to have to use something like Vishnu instead. But Perseus will become possibly your hardest hitting sub on the team. And again, if you use it on, say, on Awoken Best Cat teams, again, a very hard hitting, very powerful sub. So it is very strong overall, but again, I would caution if you're using him as skill bind resist coverage for your Liu Bei team. Next is Wukong, and Wukong follows a completely different path, but his signature aspect was the 3 skill boosts. But he does also have quite a bit of competition with DQXQ, because DQXQ and Wukong both compete for the light orb generator as well as hard orb generating spot on your team. Now, DQXQ tends to be a little more universal in that she has better board change synergy because Apocalypse is available, and at least at this point in North America, we do not have any way for Wukong to combo that will at least provide light and hard orbs alongside of water. That just doesn't exist at this point in time, so DQXQ would be the stronger option for the most part. Now, with this new evolution, he actually will lose those 3 skill boosts, which is problematic for teams that need skill boosts to come up in time, or if you're running in co-op and especially Machine Zeus farming, like it's just going to become problematic overall. But you're going to trade those skill boosts for bind immunity. Now, gaining a bind immune sub or leader is actually very powerful and potent, but again, we need to ask ourselves, where are we using Wukong that we need this bind immunity coverage? Like, is there any real pressing need? Because you are obviously losing those 3 skill boosts, which does make it more universal, as well as the light sub attribute, which again is better for monocolor teams because wood absorbs are not as much of a problem. So this new Awoken form does have a little bit of a drawback of that wood sub attribute. So Wukong does have a stronger leader skill, but in all honesty, 64 times attack and 4 times recovery for dragons is not practical when you have to match 8 connected light orbs. It's not a practical nor feasible team to make, so you're really just thinking, am I going to trade light sub-attribute for wood and 2 skill boosts for bind immunity? I feel that the 2 skill boosts has a little more flexibility overall over the bind immune card, because right now we don't generally use Wukong on too many different teams, and those teams like say Mirror don't need to have bind immune subs as much per se, so it's in a little bit of awkward place. So Wukong, I feel it's hard to say which one you should make, but I personally am leaning more towards his original form. Algetti received split evolutions that help make them better leaders or subs, but for the most part, the jammer meta does not really take off or exist, so the leader option doesn't really apply to most players unless you really want to have fun or just really love those jammers. So the light sub-attribute can also be problematic for that leadership aspect, because if you're using her as a sub on Awoken Liu Bei teams, you will have to obviously deal with light absorbed floors more often, so the Woodward form tends to be the stronger choice for the most part. Hamal also follows that split evolution style, except their leader skill is actually more viable by comparison. So their light form is able to achieve 144 times attack with a 5 orb 1 enhance and 2 light combos. So of those 2 light combos, one of them can be a 5 orb 1 enhance. So you are hard hitting along with having a modest damage mitigation component. However, the problem is, for that damage mitigation component to activate, you need to trigger your light combos, and because of that, you're going to be dealing damage and thus lowering the chances of you actually stalling, so it's a problematic scenario. It's kind of like how Dark Athena has issues stalling, except this is going to be much worse by comparison. So Hamal is going to not really be that strong of a leader, so generally speaking, you will probably want to pursue the light water form that has more rows and is just a better sub overall for the average player. I need to blow my nose. I do have allergies. It's that time of the year. Alright, I can breathe so much better now. This feels glorious. Now, the next is Freyja, and Freyja gains a reincarnated form, which is a direct upgrade in pretty much every aspect. She drops the dark sub-attribute for wood, which is great for monocolor teams. You have more damage, no risk of dark absorption bosses. You gain 1,000 weighted stats, so it's just easier to use her on Awoken Liu Bei teams. And this is a direct upgrade in pretty much every aspect, and the only drawback is the 16 million experience curve, which is shared by all reincarnated gods. Next is Sun Quan, and like Freyja, he does pretty much have a direct upgrade in every aspect. You do lose the Fire sub-attribute, which can have implications for his leadership potential. However, his leadership potential is augmented with a higher multiplier. He gains a 4th TPA, as well as those 1,000 weighted stats, so he is just stronger overall, and it really should be what you pursue for the most part. And then now himself and Orochi will kind of be competing for that 4 TPA slot on your teams. However, Sun Quan has his stats heavily skewed to recovery, whereas Orochi has his stats very heavily skewed to health. And for the most part, higher amounts of health is more important for the average team because you will be able to survive higher thresholds of damage. Furthermore, the recovery badge tends to have more bang for your buck, so you don't need to have overwhelming amounts of recovery, but you need higher amounts of health, generally speaking. So you may not actually use Sun Quan over Orochi in terms of that TPA delay slot. So again, obviously personal preference, but for myself, I feel I would lean more towards Orochi if I had the choice. And as a leader, Sun Quan obviously has bolstered offensive capabilities, but the loss of Fire sub-attribute does have implications for himself, especially considering that Hermes also lost his Fire sub-attribute, so you may be a little more pressed to find someone with that Fire sub-attribute on your team. Now, if you don't have very organic options like Gan Ning and Summer Erd, you may become a little problematic, but in all honesty, the biggest hurdle to overcome for Sun Quan Hermes teams is the active skill clause, which is needed for maximum multiplier and augmented recovery. And unfortunately, at this point in time, Water does not have a strong solution for this hole in their team, because basically Anubis has Gunma / Diao Chans, and those just work much better overall. Gunma also works on all mono wood teams. And now we come to Liu Bei, and Liu Bei is actually quite a large point of controversy because Awoken Liu Bei is wood, whereas the wood light form is the reincarnated form, which is new. Now, generally speaking, Awoken Liu Bei is going to be the stronger choice overall. And now hear me out, because even though Awoken Liu Bei has a lower multiplier, he has a wood sub-attribute. And that wood sub-attribute is crucial because if you Skyfall a light combo, you will instantly heal any light absorbing boss and pretty much basically forfeit the run. So your consistency automatically drops down. You're basically taking a gamble, an unnecessary gamble. So having a reincarnated Liu Bei, which is the light sub-attribute, is problematic because now you are going to run that risk. Now, for the most part, there are not too many dungeons with light absorbs, but those that have them are going to be harrowingly hazardous for the reincarnated form. And one that comes right at least to the top of my head is Machine Hera, and that is quite a popular strategy to use Liu Bei in that dungeon. Now, of course, the first question you need to ask yourself is, do you have duplicates? If you have duplicates, or you don't have duplicates, the order of priority should be Awoken, which is green first, and then if you have extras, make Reincarnated of Wood Light next, because you have much more universal accessibility with the Liu Bei in his Awoken form. Now, it is 64 times attack, and that tends to kill everything for the most part, and the only dungeon where you'd have troubles with if you have a less than ideal team would be skill delay resist farming from Special Descend Rush. Obviously, if you have Killer Awakenings or Killer Latents, this problem is obviously resolved, but if you don't, it can be a little problematic. So having Reincarnated Liu Bei does give you an advantage for Special Descend Rush, but if you improve your team, you don't need to have the higher multiplier. You will have the regular Awoken Liu Bei. And for the most part, outside of Special Descend Rush, you have more than enough damage to kill anything. Now, another thing that I guess you may want to keep in mind is that Reincarnated Liu Bei does have alternative leadership pairings. You are able to pair with Ganesha for augmented rank experience, which is obviously a desirable characteristic at this point in time because a lot of people just want to push rank. Or you can even pair with a Dark Metatron who has the No Skyfall clause, because this No Skyfall clause Dark Metatron has 9 times attack for gods when below 80% health. So what you simply do is push your health down a little bit, say if a reincarnated Izanagi or there's a first floor preemptive, and then you have a massively high multiplier with no Skyfalls. You pop Zeus Dios, swipe, things die. Obviously, you don't run the risk of light Skyfalls, there's a typo here. It shouldn't be there. And it is marginally faster, but again, it's a little excessive, possibly. It may be harder to find partners as well, because the great thing about Liu Bei is that he was accessible and a lot of people had him. So using reincarnated Liu Bei plus a Dark Metatron may lower your chances of finding co-op partners if you don't have someone dedicated you can use anytime you want. So all in all, I highly recommend you keep your Liu Bei in his Awoken form and only consider the reincarnated form if you have duplicates or you really don't care about those light absorbing floors. But then again, in the future, we may have light absorbing floors and you're going to be kind of screwed. Next, we transition into DQXQ, and DQXQ in her reincarnated form pumps up her damage multiplier. That is the last thing she really needed. It's kind of like how Mary gained more damage. DQXQ was 100 times row leader, which did obviously have some rainbow aspects, but for the most part, you tend to kill most things anyways. So while it may be somewhat challenging to make 4 unique elements with 8+ connected water/light orbs, you generally have enough damage already. So being pumped up to 256 times damage is completely unnecessary, and as a leader, she needed some sort of defensive utility. Furthermore, as a trend right now, reincarnated gods tend to lose their sub-attribute of a different element and gain their light. So at this point in time, DQ obviously lost her water, Apollo lost his wood, so it can become a little more problematic to form a mono light team, at least from a primary attribute aspect. So this, I guess, is partially offset by the fact that you do have a higher multiplier overall, so it may not be as detrimental, but again, it's just something to, like, a small nitpick you may want to keep in the back of your mind. So it will obviously remain a fun to play Glass Cannon leader. It's going to be a great starting card for the most part because it scales beautifully into late game from early game, but for the most part, I feel that she's just going to be a mono light powerhouse sub because she gained a 4th row awakening. And last for new cards released is Dark Orpharian. And Dark Orpharian is now going to be the new farmable trophy monster, which essentially requires the same composition as his light Orpharian alternative, except you need something different than the head. It will come from a special Descend dungeon that's coming out in the future, so don't worry, you can't make it right away. But the problem with Dark Orpharian is he's very challenging to actually form. Some people liken his evolution to like Exodia. You summon Exodia, and in this case here you need to acquire 4 unique Orpharian parts, which have about a 2% drop rate from most like the special machine descends, so you can't really count on it. It's not reliable, it's soul crushing, and you may not even get the correct part to drop. So that is obviously a problematic scenario. Granted, there is a little saving grace in that you can clear/farm Colosseum, but the amount of players who can clear Colosseum are very limited because it's a very challenging dungeon. It's very long, it's grinding, it's exhausting, and you still obviously get a random part. So it can be challenging to actually form the 4 unique parts required. So he's out of reach for the average player, and for the players who do acquire him, it's not strong enough a leader, it's more just for fun trophies. So it's a great farmable card if it was more accessible, so it's kind of like a catch-22. If you can get Dark Orpharian, you probably don't even need to run him. But as a leader, he does have 2.25 times health and recovery, along with 126 times attack for machine types. So naturally, you can use Eshamalis as well as duplicates of himself, but again, it's a restrictive team composition, and it's more so for luxury and maybe EP and flexing. I have 3 light Orpharians. I have enough parts to potentially make 3 more, but they're the wrong distribution. So again, it's a problematic scenario. I can have the parts, I just don't have the right distribution. So if I pick up a couple, I think, I don't remember, I think right legs or left legs, I don't know, I'll be able to farm them. But regardless, Dark Orpharian is out of the reach for the average player for the most part. Just a nice trophy to have possibly a year or 2 from now if it becomes easier. Now we come into buffs. Now buffs are basically just upgrades to existing cards. You don't have to do anything, it just happens. So the Norse series have been falling behind from at least a damage enhancing point of view because 2 times damage enhancement is not really that spectacular. Gemstones outclass them in every way essentially. And their main draw right now is the 1,000 weighted stats for the reincarnated forms of Loki, Freyja, and Freyr. So they have great awakenings, they have great stats, and they generally act as your basis for skill inheritance for a better active skill. So buffing their damage enhancement period from 2 to 3 turns is obviously an upgrade, but it probably won't see much feasible playtime for the most part because, again, you generally want to have something inherited over top. I can foresee this having some implications in, say, 3-player co-op when inherits don't come up, as well as if you're playing solo mode and get delayed by Hephaestus Dragon, your inherit skill will be delayed, but your base will be ready, so you have more turns to kill them. Small things, but it's a buff nevertheless. Next are the Wisdom Kings, and the Light and Dark Wisdom Kings both received a buff to their active skill to provide 2 instead of 1 turn of haste. They still suffer the same problems as the Norse gods because 2 times damage enhance is not really that spectacular, but outside of that train of thought, we can think it may have value or merit for co-op farming teams that need to have 2 turns of haste. Niche, but again, we'll take what we can get. Lu Bu now does 4 times damage enhance for devils from 3 times. Unfortunately, devil teams have kind of fallen out of the meta. We don't really have them so much, but this is a very high damage enhancement, which puts them on par of gemstone princesses. Just unfortunate, it doesn't really have a good use for it. Furthermore, the health reset can be problematic depending on the team you play, but again, a buff is a buff. A10 did receive a buff to his active skill to provide 1.5 times orb movement time for a single second, along with his board change of all 6 elements plus jammers, so that 7 element / jammer board has only applications on very true rainbow teams like Raw Dragon as a very budget alternative to Dark Callies because the jammers have no place. However, the time extend buff does allow you to at least override debuffs from bosses, so it can be used in certain situations. It could help. Like, for instance, this challenge 10 had a time debuff at the end, and if you had something like A10 inherited on your rainbow team, you will have a much easier time dealing with them. Furthermore, his leader skill now will scale at 3 colors while still achieving 5 times at 5 colors. This does provide damage control, but with 9 killers, damage control doesn't exist with A10. Last but not least are the mechanical series, and Den, Ebola, Acubens, and Algeti all received a +1 second to orb movement time on their jammer / primary orb generating active skills. So this again can be used to override time debuffs, so a niche little application there, but the jammer meta does not take off because even though Fenrir and Fenrir Viz are stronger than they used to be, it's not something that's going to really take off because Gung-Ho is loath to release jammer creating rare machine cards, and for good reason, because they don't have any value outside of those specific teams. So we had to obviously rely on farmable options, which we can inherit, but again, we don't have a big enough pool to draw from, so it's just not really going to take off. It's clumsy, it does not work in 3-player co-op, so it's going to be problematic for these cards to really see that much viability, and it's those killer awakenings that really just make them the more exciting aspect of a low base cooldown. So, in conclusion, there are a lot of exciting new patches, new changes that did occur in version 11.1. I had 2 separate articles and videos to cover all of it, and it's quite an extensive thing to take in all at once. So, let me know what you think is the most exciting aspects for yourself in terms of the new evolutions or even the 3-player gameplay mode released. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Hopefully you all have a mantastic day, and happy puzzling.